Class components are fun and kind of pain. So back in the old days, before React went fully functional, not fully functional, before, it wasn't even before, it wasn't that long ago actually, it was maybe like 6-7 years. The very popular style of React programming was to use class components instead of functional components. So we've taught you functional components, but you can also write your React components as classes, like kind of regular JavaScript classes. And so if we look at sort of a simple example here, we have like a main app class that extends React.component, as in it is a subclass of React.component. It has a constructor, it has methods like setCell that you have there, and it has a render method, which is a method that everything that extends React.component has to implement, and that returns whatever JSX the component should be rendering, right? Hopefully that makes sense. It's not too crazy. But yeah, it's basically nothing much more complicated than that. So in your constructor, you always have to call super because you are a subclass. You have to instantiate the parent class values, and then for doing stuff like state, you have to set this dot state, and then that's basically a dictionary of all of your stateful terms. So in functional components, you have stuff like for every state and then function that sets that particular state, you have to do a separate call to use state. In this case, all of the states are just put into one big dictionary, basically. And I'll show you how to update that in just a little bit. Now for class methods, you sort of define them. It's pretty simple. You have the method name, method arguments, and then the method body. And that's just basically crazy going on there. Now, for getting and setting class state, for getting a stateful value, for example, say if I go back here, say that one of these stateful terms was that I would have to do this dot state dot sum. As far as what this keyword is, we'll touch on that a little bit later today. But for now, just accept that basically this, in this case, references the class object. So in the class object, in the state field, and then in the sum key, like what is that value, basically. So you're basically just indexing into multiple objects. So to get a state, this dot state, and then the state key, basically, or the name that the state was assigned, and then to set the state, you have to call the set state method, basically, you off the state, the new value of the state, basically. Note that you can't set the state for a specific thing. You can't do like this dot state dot sum is equal to something else. No, you have to use this dot set state. That's basically how that. We'll go through a full example of this in a little bit. This is a special method, as I said, that tells React what to render for that component, and then in the return for this render method, you just put your JSX. So if you have a button here that has some text inside a div, pretty straightforward stuff. Much like exactly the same kind of stuff that you would have in a return for a functional component. Cool. So let's see an example. Where are we? Alrighty. Hopefully you can all see my VS Code.
Yep.
Yep, cool. I'm never sure if I shared a window or like the entire screen. So there we go. Cool. So here we have a functional component, right? Just simple app.js. Let's see what this thing does. Okay, right. Of course, this is going to be a whole thing, isn't it? Okay. Also, I want to see, there was an issue I was having when I was trying to do these. This breaks because Yes, if you ever see this error, I'm not entirely sure why it comes up, but it just seems to sometimes. All you have to do to fix it is just modify your package JSON so that your start command basically has this flag attached to it too. It's got to do with some SSL stuff that I did not care enough about to look further into. But yeah, it's not too crazy a fix. So if you ever see that, that's how you fix it. If I run this, then okay, cool. Now we have on, it's like noughts and crosses kind of. So, you know, for some reason circle didn't pick the center because circle's an idiot. And yeah, basically you click and then every time you click, it changes the player. Cool. There you go. That's the basic functional component version of this app. So let's change this into a class component because we can, and why not? So what I'm going to do is, well, class app extends. And what do we extend? Does anyone remember? What are all class components a subclass of? Anyone want to put something in the chat?
React component.
Yep, react.component. Cool. And then it's a class, so we have the curly braces. And the first thing we do is the constructor method. We call super to instantiate the parent class stuff. And then we have some stateful things to take care of. So if we look at the functional component, we see that we have two calls to use state. As a side note, please don't you call use state like this, actually import it like as a separate thing from React like this. I just think it looks a lot cleaner. Like this is a little bit lazy if you ask me. But yes, cool. So we have to now take care of these stateful things. So one of the states is called board and the other one is called first user. So we'll do this dot state is equal to board, and then we'll set that equal to this default board, because that's essentially all that's happening here. Yeah, the default state that's being assigned to board is this default board. They've just defined it in a separate constant. And first user, we will give the initial state of false to. Cool. And that is our constructor method done. He said, hopefully that doesn't break. If it does break, that'll be interesting. And now what we have to do next is we have to translate this function into a class method. So we can do that pretty simply. Set cell takes in an X and a Y value. Okay, and then we can, I'll copy all of this code in and then we'll see how we have to change it. So first line, line 15, const letter is equal to first user. Like if the first user is true, then we're going to assign letter to be an X. If the first user is false, then we're going to assign letter to be O. That's what this ternary expression is doing. But if I try and run this, the class component isn't going to know what first user is referring to. It's going to say that first user is undefined. Like, I don't know what you want me to do with this. So the reason is, so first user is a stateful term, right? So if we look in here, first user was defined here. It's one of the things that it's the stateful value that we've assigned in this useState thing. And so remember, to access stateful terms in class components, we have to prefix them with this dot state dot first user. Similarly, we have to do the same thing with board, because remember, if you remember, board was the other stateful component. We have to do this dot state dot board. Now that's that set. Now we're not going to call these set of functions because they don't exist in this class. What we'll do instead is this dot set state, and then we'll set the state of the board to be new board, and we'll set the state of the first user to be, what do? They just set it so they just set it to be the opposite of what it currently is. So if it's false, then not false is true. If it's true, then not true will be false. That's what this negation is doing. So I'll just do not this dot state dot first user. Cool. Any questions so far, or is this more or less making sense? If there are any questions, all right, cool. Thank you for the thumbs up, Sarah. Cool. So far so good. Now, the last thing to do is our render method, yeah? So render, and then that returns. And so I'm going to dump it in here. And is that going to be? Oh, I haven't set up ESLint properly. That's going to be irritating. Anyway, let's just indent all of this JSX by a tab space. Then that should be good. Okay, so we should be done, right? Let me get rid of this functional component. So who can tell me what's going on here? Why are we still getting errors like board is not defined, set cell is not defined? Why is the compiler still screaming at us? Anyone know? What have I missed? Taking a good look at this return, at this JSX, what am I doing that I need to change? Any ideas? Or an example we've seen before? Can I just call board?
You have to use this .state.board.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So let me prefix all of those with that. Cool. That's almost there. Now we're just getting set cell is not defined. So we have to do the same thing for all of these set cell commands. Except it's not state, it's just this dot set cell, because set cell it will think is like some other function that's defined elsewhere in the file. If you want to say it's a class method specifically, then you have to put a this before it so that it knows to look in the class for this method. It's sort of like if you guys are familiar with the self keyword in Python, it's a similar deal here. And if we do that, we just get some warnings, and we all know as good software engineering students that warnings can be ignored with no peril at all. So let's see what happens. Cool. Well, this seems to be working, more or less, yeah? So that's how, in short, we convert a functional component into a class component. Class extends React.component. You have a constructor method called super. Set your stateful values in a dictionary like this. To alter them or to read from them, you have to use this dot state and this dot set state. And generally, you'll be using this, the keyword this, a lot. And that's the basics of it. This example is not too crazy. And so you might be wondering, and you would be very correct to wonder, why don't we use class components more often? Like why are class components bad? Why weren't we taught class components in the course? There are a few reasons. I don't have time to go into all of them today, but we'll touch on some of them. So classes can get really confusing, particularly with things like this keyword. So I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Before we touch on that, classes are also not as performant unless you're dealing with really big code bases. So basically, so how React works, in case you guys don't know, is so what happens with React is that basically React gets compiled or transpiled to vanilla JavaScript, which is then run by the browser, right? And in the process of that transpilation, often things get minified and so on and so forth. And you'll see that classes are not minified as nicely as functions are, which is one of the reasons why you get some performance degradation. Classes can also get really large, as in it just there ends up being a lot of code in them because there's a lot of boilerplate code that you have to write for classes. Now you didn't see much of that in that example because that example was very simple. But if you poke around on like Stack Overflow posts and that sort of thing, which have class components, you'll see when I say React lifecycle methods, I mean where are we looking for? I don't want. So there's a bunch of methods. So I showed you the constructor and the render method. There's a bunch of other stuff like component did mount and component will unmount. Basically, these are events that are triggered basically when something changes, state changes, so on and so forth. When a component is removed from the DOM, that sort of thing. And so you have to do a lot of this cleanup and you have to write a lot of boilerplate code if you're doing a class component, which you don't have to do in a functional component, because a lot of these lifecycle methods like component did mount and component will unmount and other things that you'll probably come across at some point can all basically be collapsed into the use effect hook that you see in functional components. So just to give you a quick example with class components, I prepared a brief demonstration in here. So where are we? Am I cool? So I've got what you would think is a fairly simple class component. It's just class app extends react.component. In the constructor, we just have one stateful term, which is x. And I have a function to increment x, which will just set state to the current value of x plus 1. So it'll just add 1 to it. And then in my render, holds the current value of x, and then a button that when it's clicked should increment the value of x by 1. So let's see what happens if I try and run it. Cool. We see, so the page renders, we see the 0. And if I click this button, I'm really spamming it, but nothing's happening. So, and if I look in the console, all of the errors, but they're all the same, basically. And if I click here, let's try this again. Cool. So it's basically saying it can't read properties of undefined. So it's, and this is where, no pun intended, this is where we get into some of the annoying things about JavaScript and how it scopes certain keywords. Basically, within this function, now JavaScript doesn't know what the this keyword refers to anymore. It's basically lost track of it. And the reason for that is due to how we've actually called this function in the onClick handler. And so without getting too technical, a nice clean way of explaining it. So I'll just leave it at basically when JavaScript doesn't know, when JavaScript doesn't have a clear idea of what this keyword is referring to, in certain modes, it will change it. It will set this keyword to be undefined, which is exactly what's happened here. So there are a couple of ways to fix this. The easiest of which is to just wrap this in an arrow function. So it looks like this. And now if I do this, Why is that not working? Let's see, maybe I have to do, why is that? Okay. If I try that, wait, why is assignment? Okay. Let's see. Yeah, now it works. And the reason for that is because arrow functions, as opposed to normal functions, don't actually rescope the this keyword inside them, but normal functions do. And it's all, as you can see, like, are you confused? Because I'm confused trying to explain it to you, and like it's a bit of a mess. My point being, there are definitely other ways around it. You can go and you can look into the bind keyword. You can lexically bind the value of this to. It's a mess. Case in point being, this is one of the reasons why we tend not to use. You can really get yourself into a pickle. This is a fairly simple example, and I think we can already you can already see how sort of messy this has become. And yeah, in short, this is why we tend to avoid class components. One of the reasons why. The other reason, what I'm talking about, so I ran yarn build. So what yarn build does is yarn build actually runs the transpilation of the React code into the vanilla JavaScript code, which is what happens in here. And so if we look at, I believe it's in main, this is what your beautiful React code is being converted into. This is minified JavaScript. Isn't it wonderful to look at? It's so readable. I love it. And you have not been through hell until you've had to actually read through some of this and refactor it into readable code manually, because that's the fun part. But normally when you minify code, when you transpile it, the function names get reduced to like a single character thing. So as you can see, like in this case, like we have a variable that's just been reduced to R, like even though I'm sure in the original code it wouldn't have been called that. But when you're dealing with class methods, that isn't actually what happens. They actually keep their full name. So if I look for increment X, you can find increment X is still here in this document, unminified, basically. And that's just a small example of one of the things that can go wrong performance-wise, because if you have a lot of this, it's a lot of unminified stuff. It starts to add very slightly to the size of the bundle, and then there are other reasons that, you know, as I said, very slight difference, but it's sort of something we just prefer to avoid, if at all possible. Cool beans. Alrighty. Any questions about class components or anything that I've said, or is there anything people would like me to repeat before we move on to some material UI goodness? We'll wait another little bit. As always, if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to chuck them in the chat or just unmute, cut me off. So in general, class component equals bad. You will come across them in the workplace because there's a lot of legacy code out there. I've definitely come across them a lot, just because, you know, so it's good to know that they exist, and it's good to be vaguely familiar with them. They're not terrible. They have their uses. And if you need to be really particular with something and you really want to like be really drilled down into like what's happening in the different stages of the component lifecycle, then those extra class like React lifecycle methods can be quite useful. But in general, I would say that now, particularly with the advent of hooks like useState, useEffects, and all that sort of stuff, there's limited need for class components anymore. And often using them will only make your code more confusing and harder to work with in the long run. Hopefully that answered your question, William. But yeah, cool. If there's nothing else, let's skip over to Material UI, because that's where the fun begins.